Hi everyone, we'll get started in just a couple minutes. Good evening, everyone. My name is Katie Gandhi, and I work at the Bloomington Public Library. The library has partnered with the McLean County Greenways Committee and the McLean County Regional Planning Association to bring you tonight's program. I just want to recommend that everybody keep your microphones off and even possibly your videos off as well. That will help improve the quality of the video for everybody, I believe. And then finally, I just want to let you know that exactly 2 weeks from tonight, on Thursday, April 29th, we'll be doing another program about wildflowers in McLean County. So I have put the registration link for that program in the chat box. So if that sounds of interest to you, I hope you will join us for that.
Thanks, Katie. Good evening, everyone. I'm Deanna Frauci, and I'm the chair for the Greenways program. I'd like to welcome you this evening. Greenways' mission, by the way, is to connect McLean County residents with natural areas and improve their quality of life. To find out more, you can see on the screen the website, mclean.org/greenways. You can go there later and find out more about the program. Another thing I'd like to remind you of is that if you have a question during the presentation, please put it in the chat box and our speaker will answer questions after the presentation. And as Katie just reminded you to, please, if you're not muted, please mute yourself and turn your video off too.
Sorry, you're muted. Deanna, I'm sorry, you're muted. I cannot.
That happened. Okay, here we go.
Could you start at the finding birds?
Yes.
Yes.
Thousands of birds will be migrating through McLean County this spring. More than 314 species of birds have been recorded in this county, some very common and some very rare. Angelo Capparella, ISU Emeritus Professor of Vertebrate Zoology, also with the John Wesley Powell Audubon Chapter Conservation, he is Conservation Chair, and a member of the Greenways Advisory Committee, will share some of the best places to birdwatch locally and let us know which species we might expect to find. Angelo.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this talk. So in terms of finding birds in McLean County, I actually moved here in 1988 to take the job at ISU. And I've really benefited from previous birders in our area, especially the late, great Dale Birkenholtz, as well as continuing to learn from birders who are canvassing the county, probably even as we speak. We are very lucky that I think we're probably at the most active I've ever seen or know of in McLean County in terms of active birders who really know their stuff and lots of good areas to access. And so tonight's presentation is just to kind of particularly aimed at those of you who are pretty new to birding in terms of what resources you need, where to go, and what you might see. And so considering how many birds we have recorded in the county, which is 319, this obviously has to be a fairly eclectic overview of the actual birds themselves, but I hope I can at least get you started, and then you can see my contact information on this slide that will allow you to contact me or other birders that you know for more information. Next. Clearly, once we get you to places to look for birds, you need to have some equipment to really enjoy them. And certainly the most basic piece of equipment are binoculars, seen in the lower left there. Now, binoculars can come in a bewildering assortment of types, and there is no ideal binocular in terms of magnification, field of vision, ergonomic feel, and you just have to sort of explore on birding sites, reviews of binoculars, your own financial situation, as well as the way I did it was anytime I'd go with a bunch of birders, especially if they seemed to have a neat pair, I would ask to borrow them and take a look and then investigate whether I wanted to upgrade to that level. But as you get into birding, you might want to also expand to a spotting scope. In the upper right there, you'll see a spotting scope. These are really incredibly useful for waterfowl birding as well as other water birds that are on our reservoirs. We have two really wonderful reservoirs locally that allow us to see lots of birds. And if you do decide to invest in a spotting scope, don't forget to also invest in a good head, as they call it, that middle slide there, as well as a good tripod that connects the head, the scope, the head, and then the tripod. Don't go cheap on a tripod. I've seen too many people get a wonderful spotting scope and a cheap tripod, and that will just completely ruin it. And then finally, although I'm not there yet personally, a lot of people in the upper left are moving to more and more photography. To that end, the photographs you'll see today are not mine, but ones that I've downloaded from the internet, as well as borrowed from other folks such as Deanna, and that's what you'll be seeing today. And that's becoming incredibly popular, and we have some outstanding bird photographers within our community. Next. Next slide, please. Once you have your equipment handy, you'll need to know, well, what is it I'm looking at as I visit these different areas? And I want to recommend some of these resources here. The most basic literature component would be a field guide. And really, at this point, the Sibley Birds, second edition, is probably the best. If you plan to do any continental birding, you might as well just get the whole East and West combined as the Sibley Guide to the Birds. But if you're confining yourself to Eastern North America, including Illinois, the Sibley Birds of the East would be the one to get. Now, you can also download this as an app. You can see in the bottom left there that you can download the entire book, and it's fantastic because not only do you get all of the pictures and the descriptions and everything else, but you also get songs so that you can actually, if you hear a song, you can play it and see if it matches. Other good bird resources would be as you get into wanting to know more about the biology of the birds, the Sibley Guide to Bird Life and Behavior is a really nice one. If you happen to find in a used bookstore, because it's been out of print, The Birds of Illinois by Bolin, although it came out some years ago, it's a really nice historical overview of bird distribution and abundance within Illinois. As we go down to the lower right, there's actually a journal for Illinois birds called the Meadowlark that the Illinois Ornithological Society puts out. And then in the bottom middle there, I would be remiss in not mentioning our own local author, Michael Redder, who started birding here, went to Illinois Wesleyan. In 2017, he published a book, A Field Guide to Birds of Illinois, which I highly recommend. A lot of wonderful insights and identification. It doesn't cover all of the birds you might see in Illinois, but it's the vast majority and certainly all the common ones. Next. And then to help you further try to figure out what you're seeing, because there are so many species out there, the JWP Audubon Society has put together a checklist of the birds of McLean County, which has a ton of information, including what's the likelihood that you're seeing it, assuming that you also accompany this with looking at your book to know that you're looking at the right time of year that the bird's likely to be here. And this is just the front page of a 2-page checklist. And already, just in the last since 2018, we've added some more species to the list because of all the dynamic birding going on. And you can find that current list, 2018 list, at this website here. And again, there's a second page that shows a lot more of the status of birds. But we will be issuing very shortly the latest edition of 2021, which will have 319 species. It's a lot of birds and can get quite confusing. Next. So where do you go to find these birds in McLean County and maybe even surrounding counties? Well, the first slide showed the Greenways website, and we'll show that again at the end. It's really great in highlighting some of the really nice areas. But some other places I wanted to send you to, I wanted to give you a couple more places to go to find places locally and as well as even beyond McLean County. A couple of interesting statistics that you may be unaware of is if you look at the 50 states, Illinois ranks 49th in the amount of natural vegetation left since European settlement. So we've really hammered our ecosystems, but there are some that are still there, some remnants that are left, and a lot of people are trying to protect and expand those remnants. And we rank in Illinois 44th among the 50 states in the amount of publicly accessible green space. So we still have a way to go to really kind of improve both the amount of natural vegetation as well as the accessible green space. But thankfully, over the last several decades, due to very active individuals, non-governmental organizations, and governmental organizations, we've made some good headway. The McGIS.org site, if you've never looked at it, I'd really highly recommend. It has many different layers, including aerial maps, and it also has a parks layer. I've given you the kind of pathway by which you can find it that will complement what you'll find on the McLean County Greenways website. Next. But as you go further afield, particularly as you go into southeastern Woodford County, where much of the Parklands Foundation's activity lies, you'll see that this visual of the PSC iView, which is the name of a mapping tool that is available to the public. You can see we're really working hard to try to knit together lands throughout the entire Mackinac River. And if you actually go to this place, you will see every single protected natural area in the entire state of Illinois. It will also, if you click on it, tell you if it's publicly accessible or not. This was a monumental achievement that I helped lead a few years ago. I'm very proud of it. And I think more people might want to use this. A lot of metadata embedded, so you just go to this site and click on it and play around with that. So there's a lot of ways in which you can find places to go. Next. If we go back locally, I've sort of organized these a little bit by season. Let's start off with winter birding. A lot of times people think, oh, it's winter, I'm just going to stay indoors all the time. Don't do that. There are a lot of great birds that are out there. In fact, many that you'll only see in the winter. And there are a lot of great places to visit to see these winter birds. Here's a nice winter shot of Kamlara Park, which surrounds Lake Evergreen. Next. Next slide. Yes, thank you. This winter, birders were particularly enamored to see an eruption of finches from the boreal forests up north. Every so often, whenever the food resources are a little low up north, these birds will visit us. Some of them every few years, others only once in a decade. So for example, if you look out on the lower right, you'll see the pine siskin. We get those fairly frequently, but boy, we had a big influx this year. And if you went to the feeders down at Sugar Grove Foundation, that Sugar Grove Nature Center runs in Funk's Grove, you would have seen quite a few. Next to it on the left is the common redpoll. We don't get a lot of those every winter. In fact, many winters we don't get any, but we had lots come down this year, and a great place to view those was in Kamlara Park, surrounding Lake Evergreen. But probably the stars of the show this winter were the two upper birds, the red crossbill and particularly the white-winged crossbills, whose bills are actually crossed so that they can actually get into the cones of conifers. We were astounded when we had such an influx here that you could go out and see these almost on a daily basis in the middle of the winter, particularly around Lake Bloomington. One of our favorite places to stop was the Champion Federal Preserve, which is one of the Parklands Foundation preserves around Lake Bloomington. And it was a real joy to be able to see these birds because you just don't see them that often. Some of you may have had perhaps the siskins at your feeders, and maybe even a redpoll, but the upper two, the crossbills, you really needed to go out and find good conifers, and we were very fortunate. So just learning, in fact, we had never realized that the Champion Federal land was going to be that productive for these coniferous dwelling birds. Next. Also in the winter, although we think of these barren agricultural fields, we do get some interesting birds that come in the winter. Next. That make it worthwhile cruising all of these fields during the wintertime. This year in the upper left, you can see we had quite an influx of snowy owls. I think we had up to 8, if I recall, the number of sightings of individuals that one could see by cruising the backcountry roads and finding them in the fields. We also had on the right a lot of short-eared owls spend the winter, which was pretty neat. Short-eared owls used to be a breeder in our county, but because we've lost the large expanses of wet prairies, they no longer visit us except during migration and in the wintertime. But it was really fascinating to be able to go out into the county fields and see these. And along with our owls, we also had a really interesting bird, the rough-legged hawks, which do visit every winter, but they seem to be more common this winter. Some people confuse these with red-tailed hawks, which are also around in the winter. But these rough-legged hawks, unlike the red-tails, which you hear all year and breed, rough-legged hawks are only a visitor in the wintertime. And there are some other birds that you'll see in the winter out in these agricultural fields as well. So it's a fun area to visit, even in the winter, both our parks as well as our agricultural fields. You'll see different birds. And that's the key to really seeing different birds, is different birds like different habitats. So you really have to diversify your habitats, and you have to diversify the seasons in which you go out in order to make sure that you see a lot of different species that are available. Next. We're very fortunate in terms of having 2 nice waterfowl sites, sites that are good for birds that are wintering unless the lakes freeze over completely, or that are particularly seen during migration. One that I'm sure most of you already know is Evergreen Lake, which is surrounded by Kamlara Park and actually straddles the county borders of McLean and Woodford. Now, the bottom picture shows the lake during the summer when you don't see much except some of our breeding birds like Canada geese. But you really want to go out here in the winter. I know it can be kind of brutally cold, but get a spotting scope or find a friend with a spotting scope and get out and look at the open water, and you'll just be amazed at what you'll see during winter and during migration. Next. Lake Bloomington is also very good in terms of wintertime and migration. Again, you go out during the summer and you just won't see much in the way of waterfowl. And also the human activity will be much greater. But go out in the wintertime and in the early migration of waterfowl, and it's just amazing what you can see. And there are a number of points around the lake that you can get nice views of the lake, as well as walk through some of the preserves that Parklands Foundation has and that are opened by the people who manage Lake Bloomington. So again, although this shows the lake in the winter, in the summer, go out in the winter, go out in the early migration for waterfowl, most of which is now over, but we've had a very good one this year. Next. And then a very surprisingly productive small lake, Berkey Pond at Heartland Community College, has been particularly interesting to get to. There's a lot of good places you can get along that particular pond in the winter. We have other sites within the community, such as White Oak Park and some other smaller ponds. And sometimes you'll see waterfowl in these smaller ponds that you're not going to see very easily or at all on these larger lakes. So just like different habitats of woodlands, you want to look at different sizes and surrounding habitats of lakes. And Berkey Pond is one that many of us enjoyed watching this winter and early spring. Next. So again, what are you likely to see? Well, here are 4 species that used to actually, well, one used to actually breed in McLean County, the trumpeter swan, and the other 3 still do, wood duck, Canada goose, and mallards. So you go out now to some of these areas and you're likely to see certainly Canada geese, you don't have to go far for those, and mallards, both of which seem to breed in any little pothole they can find, and wood ducks if you're along our wooded ways such as the Mackinac River and some of the creeks. Trumpeter swans are actually making a comeback. Trumpeter swan, our largest swan in North America, once bred throughout our area and into the upper Midwest, was pretty much wiped out, but has been reestablished in the upper Midwest, and now has become quite a common migrant down here. I believe they actually have a few records now of them breeding in northwestern Illinois. We don't have the kind of habitat that they could breed here. The breeders that you see here are mute swans. But trumpeter swans have really graced our area quite a bit. In fact, I still remember some years ago when the first one was seen at the Schrader Nature Reserve run by the Bloomington Normal Water Reclamation District down in the southern part, just south of town, of Bloomington Normal. And now you can see them regularly. It can be a little confusing because 2 other swans, the tundra swan, which is a native swan, and the mute swan, which is a non-native and sometimes problematic species, can also be seen as well. And the latter, the mute swan, will even breed locally. Again, very interesting to see the trumpeter swan making a comeback. I don't think it'll ever breed in McLean County again, but certainly will probably be breeding more in Illinois and is definitely recovering in the upper Midwest. Next. Of course, what we're interested in when we're doing our winter and early spring migration, or late winter, early spring migration birding, are looking at the many different kinds of waterfowl that come through our area. And to that end, we certainly want to visit different sized parks that have lakes or ponds, and you'd just be amazed at the riot of colors that are expressed by many of these different kinds of birds. Again, you'll need to learn to look at these birds carefully. As with actually almost all birds, one of the first things to key on in is the bill. You can probably see the bills look different among these 4 species. That can get you at least to the type of bird and even down to the species of bird. So one thing I always ask when people ask me to help them identify a bird is, what does the bill look like? And you can see that there's quite a diversity there, reflecting the different feeding ecologies that these species are going to show. But again, we usually with waterfowl also, as you see with the northern shoveler, the female is a hard one to identify, but the males are always in the gaudy colors that make them much easier to tell, although often at a great distance, which is where the spotting scopes come in handy. Next. Don't confuse your ducks with other kinds of waterfowl. We get grebes as well, pied-billed grebe and horned grebe being shown here. And in fact, this horned grebe is actually showing you with his foot lifted out of the water why he's not a duck. Notice that the the doesn't have a waterfowl kind of a foot. It's not totally webbed. It has webbed toes, but not a webbed foot. Pine-bill grebes will actually breed very, very locally. Horned grebes are only in migration. In fact, I'd say the vast majority of waterfowl is only here either in the winter or in migration. So you really have to take a look at it during that time. Grebes are fun to watch because they'll often submerge as they dive down looking for fish. And you'll think they've drowned because where are they? They really will, with those wonderful webbed toes, kick themselves around underwater and surface quite some distance off from where they first were. And they really didn't drown, but they're really, really fun to watch. But again, they're not a duck. Next. And this year particularly, on the left, we really had a lot of common loons come through. Common loons were being seen at both Evergreen Lake as well as at Lake Bloomington, even at White Oak Park. They typically require pretty deep water, so you would expect to see them, say, at Berkeley Pond. Some of them were still in winter plumage, others were already molting into what you see here as summer plumage. And as we got along with the migration, some of them were even vocalizing, which we think of as a wonderful sound evocative of the Great North Woods. And so common loons were a real hit because I remember at Lake Evergreen, I actually saw 10 at once, which I don't think I've ever seen that many before. That was really cool. And other loons can come through too, but at much less frequency. In fact, the specific loon, which is in a winter plumage, was at some gravel ponds near Downs and was an incredible find because this was the first record for the county, for McLean County. It added to our species list in a wonderful way. And to that end, it bumped up our list, but it also, for many people, was an actual life bird. That is, it was the first time that anybody, including myself, had ever seen the species. So that made it a really exciting bird for everyone to go see. And we have a very good communication system now. Certainly encourage people who really want to get into birds. We have a Facebook and some other resources that you can ask about that spread the word very rapidly when we see really interesting birds that are around. And so that allows people to go and take a look at these things. Next. And, oops, I skipped one. Loon, and then next slide. Thank you. Yeah, and also other kinds of birds can be seen frequenting our lakes and ponds. Some of these you're probably already familiar with. Many of you may have gone out in the upper left to look at the American white pelican migration. There were lots of them, particularly at Lake Bloomington, but also at Evergreen Lake, and it was incredible. These are huge birds, and it's only been in the last 15 years or so that we've really been seeing these vast numbers showing up here locally. Of course, we also have herons and egrets that can be seen in the shorelines of our areas and even along creeks in the case of the great blue herons particularly. Great blue heron in the lower right there is a very common bird, and they'll often nest locally in big rookeries. And if you canoe the Mackinac River, you'll sometimes pass by these rookeries that can have 20, 30, 40 nests of very loud young nesting, usually in March. Green herons up in the upper right are ones that come in and breed, including at some of our smaller ponds and preserves. Heard sightings recently at Angler's Pond. And then in the lower left, great egrets, we don't have them breeding here, but they come through. We can see them on migration, and we can see them in late summer coming back south again. And a really nice place to see it is at the south end of Evergreen Lake. If you have ever been out at Evergreen Lake, you'll know that there's where 6 Mile Creek enters into the lake, there's a nice bridge, there's a marsh on both sides, and that's a good place to look for the great egrets as they come back through our area. Next. And then I wanted to mention also 2 other species. One, the double-crested cormorants. I wanted to mention these particularly because lately they've been misidentified as loons by many people, but they aren't loons. Again, if you look at the bill, of course it's hard to see at a distance, compare that to the earlier slide, you'll see a very different shape. And also, whereas the common loon tends to hold its head horizontal, double-crested cormorants tend to tilt its head up a little bit. And they also are all very dark birds, and they'll also perch a lot up in the trees. A loon would never do that. I've seen big numbers perched in trees at Lake Evergreen. And also during this March, we've had some nice views of sandhill cranes. Sandhill cranes are are bouncing back. They used to breed also in McLean County, but again, we don't have any large wet prairies anymore. But they are increasingly breeding here in northern Illinois, particularly, and a lot in Wisconsin, and they will be migrated. They migrated through already, and many of us went out to see and hear those species, and they'll often make a stop or two at some of our areas, sometimes even right in a flooded field in town. You can sometimes have sandhill cranes, and notice how they fly with their neck outstretched, unlike a great blue heron, which has its neck folded. Next. Wet prairies. Wet prairies used to actually be the dominant habitat within McLean County, but now it's very little is left, unfortunately. But if you want to go see wet prairie, go to the Grove. The Grove is one of the newest parks in the Bloomington system along Kickapoo Creek, east of town. And not only is it a wet prairie restoration, but it's also a restored creek. If you look down in the lower left, many of you probably don't know, but our creeks are in terrible shape. If you see this kind of a bank with erosion, these incised creeks, you'll know that that's due to human changes in the rate at which water is entering into these creeks. Don't even have to be channelized to end up this way. They can also end up this way, as is unfortunately happened in the Mackinac River, just because we're blasting water through these channels. If you want to really know what a wet prairie and a true meandering prairie stream look like, go to the Grove. They actually took bulldozers out there to actually bring it all back because it was a mess before, and it's now one of the best examples of wet prairie within Illinois. And certainly about the only one that's of this quality in our area. And the Friends of Kickapoo Creek, a former group that unfortunately went defunct because we couldn't find enough people willing to volunteer, was instrumental in getting this going. Next. And one of the groups of birds that birders really love to see are rails that are very hard to find. And the Grove is a really nice place to certainly find the two on the left, Virginia rail and Sora. And if you're really incredibly lucky, these are like the rails that birders dream about. Yellow rail and black rail. Trying to find these are, most of us have only seen them once, maybe we've heard them many times, but to actually see either of these species is really tough. But the Grove may be one of the best places to do that in. Next. And fluttles. Probably you haven't heard of fluttles before, but flooded field, fluttle birding. Go back into the agricultural fields as we get into the spring, and you can often be amazed at what you can find. Next. People don't realize that we actually are a corridor of migration for a lot of what you sort of think of as shorebirds, gulls, terns, plovers, sandpipers. Now, most of you are familiar with killdeer in the lower right, which sort of stay here and breed, and ring-billed gulls, which you'll see a lot in the winter along the lakes, but you'll also get terns coming through and plovers coming through. Next. As well as a whole host of sandpipers. Believe it or not, all of these can be seen in Illinois. The little sandpipers are collectively called peeps. And then you can see an example with the semi-palmated sandpiper. And then we get other incredible birds too, just a whole array of birds. And they particularly like these fluttles, these flooded fields. So we exchange information among birders as to where are the fields flooded this year. And those are places we like to go. The one exception to this is the American woodcock. The American woodcock is a shorebird, but it doesn't live in the shore. It breeds in the bottomland forests, displays a lot in March over the fields. One of my favorite places to look at that is at Moraine View, but also parts of Evergreen Lake are great as well. You won't see this at a fluttle, but all the other shorebirds you will if you get out there looking at flooded fields at this time of year. And so I know it's the bane of farmers, of course, to have flooded fields, but when they're there, they can be really good for seeing migrating shorebirds of different types. Next. And then spring migration, which we're now into in summer breeding birding. Here's a beautiful picture from Deanna, a Merwin Preserve with the bluebells. And of course, lots of birds are using the Merwin Preserve up along the Mackinac River, part of the Parklands Foundation Nature Preserve Network, as well as many other woodlands. Next. Moraine View State Park is a fantastic place. If you haven't been there, you really owe it to yourself to go. It has lots of trails and lots of habitats and lots of good birding that you can do at Moraine View State Park. Again, just north of us, just south of Route 9. We're very fortunate to have that oasis of habitat. Next. And of course, Kamwara Park has a lot of woodlands as well, and some grasslands too, and the waters. That's a good place to go as well. And really any wooded area is good during the spring migration time for, particularly for songbirds. Next. Of course, one group of birds that I particularly like are those that are aerial. Red-tailed hawks are here all year. We've been very lucky that bald eagles have taken up residence after first establishing themselves about 11 years or so ago in southeastern Woodford County. They now are breeding in multiple places around the county. And turkey vultures come back every year to grace our skies. And we are now investigating a rumored osprey nest near Lake Evergreen. We don't know for sure, but there's been a lot of sightings in the summer, and we think we know where it might be. And so I'm working with another ornithologist to try to figure that out. That will be a great bird to get back breeding in our area. Next. And of course, owls. We have a nice diversity of owls, not just the ones that are there in the winter, such as the snowy and the short-eared, but during the all year round, eastern screech owls. I know some people have been showing me their screech owl boxes with young in them. Great horned owls, which are particularly found in the woodlots and upland woods around the county, and then barred owls, which have really been increasing in numbers along our bottomland forests. So, I mean, it's hard to go out along the Mackinac for any length of time and not see or hear barred owls. So owls are out there and are really fun to look for really year round. These three species at least. Next. Again, other places to go, the Fox Grove, upper right, you'll see Sugar Road Nature Center, and they run in the back a really nice bird feeder system, a pretty impressive one, for which you can just stand on the side and really see birds close up, as you can also do with your own bird feeders. You can see in the left, they have many wonderful trails through both woods and then down in the lower right, as well as through tall grass prairie. Not the wet prairie that you'll see at the Grove, but the drier upland tall grass prairie. All of these different habitats are worthwhile visiting to see different birds. Next. And again, Fox Grove is great in the spring, the summer, and in the fall. I'm sure many of you have taken a trip through Fox Grove, run by owned by Sugar Grove Foundation before, just southwest of town, just near Shirley. Next. Again, it'd be hard to profile all the hundreds of species that can be seen in these woodlands. I particularly like woodpeckers, so I thought I'd just show you a few of those and highlight one in particular. The pileated woodpecker has, in recent years, moved into our county. No doubt it was here originally in pre-European settlement times, but with so much of the big timber cut, it's taken some years for the timber to regrow, and now we see pileated woodpeckers in numerous places breeding, both at Moraine View, Fox Grove, and out at Merwin. And that's pretty cool. And in a similar vein, the red-headed woodpecker in the lower right has been making a comeback in those areas of savannas that we've restored. Next. Another group of interest are flycatchers. This can often be confusing to beginning bird watchers, particularly the members of the genus Impidinax. And this is where you've got realized that birding is done as much by song and call as it is by sight. So that's why that app of Sibley that has the songs on it, in addition to all of the visuals, is a really useful way to deal with that. And then you can see a great crested flycatcher, which breeds here in our good woodlands, as do eastern wood pewees. And just to give you an example of exciting news, scissor-tailed flycatcher showed up. I think it was only our second county record last fall down near one of the detention basins. And that immediately everybody went out to see that. Next. Ewing Park is one of our primo places, especially Hedge Apple Woods. Here you can see Matthew Winks with the JWP Audubon Society, who helped lead an effort to document the birds, migratory birds, using this area sufficiently that we were able to get it established as an Audubon important bird area. Very hard to get that established. You have to have a lot of data to do that. And this is also why John and Wesley Powell Audubon does a lot of its bird walks out to that area. And we'll be doing those bird walks starting this weekend. And if you go to the JWP Audubon Facebook page, you can see, or if you get our newsletter, you can see when the other walks are. And so this is a real treasure. It's one of the few, in fact, it's the only designated important bird area in the entire county. Next. And the goal of spring birding is to see how many warblers you can find. Many people aware of these really jewels of the woods, vast majority of which pass through. So you have to go out during late April, early May, particularly to see these. Just although a few will stay and breed, a couple of records of Prothonotary breeding and yellow warblers, but you really want to get out now and start seeing these warblers. This is one of the great North American migration phenomena in North America. That is just amazing. The New World warblers are just incredible. In the lower right is a prairie warbler, which is a very rare species in our area in terms of migrating through, but was seen recently at Hidden Creek in Normal. Again, you never know where these things are going to show up, potentially even in your own backyard. Next. And of course, tanagers and orioles are real favorites as they come back to breed in our area. All four of these will breed in our area. Next. And one habitat type that's very rare now, but used to be extremely common, are the oak hickory savannas. These are the groves. In fact, Blooming Grove, Bloomington, was once named for this. Unfortunately, these were prime sites to settle, and so were quickly paved over and cut down. But Parklands Foundation owns some of these groves, and we've been trying to restore them so that they can support species that particularly like these groves, such as the one shown on the right. Next. And of course, the dry prairie is pretty rare too. We've spent a lot of time trying to restore prairie of different quality in McLean County. This particular prairie is actually right over the border in the Letcher Basin Preserve in Woodford County. But prairie restoration has been a real big focus for a lot of groups that do conservation within our area. Next. And can be particularly conducive for attracting New World sparrows. Now, not all of these sparrows are prairie sparrows. The chipping sparrow is a more woodland sparrow that you find in town. But be aware that the house sparrow, which is actually not a true sparrow, not a New World sparrow, often gets a lot of negative press, deservedly so, as an introduced species. But the New World sparrows really deserve your attention, especially due to their vocalizations. They're really wonderful and are sounds of spring. Next. Some birds have been returning to our area. Wild turkeys are successfully reintroduced. Whooping cranes are now coming flying over our area, as being reintroduced into Wisconsin. Trumpeter swans I've mentioned before. And blue grosbeaks are expanding their range northward, or actually shifting their whole range northward with global warming, and are now a breeding bird where when I first moved here, you'd hardly ever see them at all. Next. But we're also now going to be losing birds. Of course, we lost the greater prairie chicken, which used to be abundant when we lost the prairie. And we're now losing the bobolink as a breeding bird. And the northern harrier we have as a wintering and migratory bird, but unfortunately the prairies that it liked, big prairies, don't exist anymore. So we see a lot of fluctuations in bird abundance and presence. Next. You can see why, if you look at this incredible slide, you'll see that pretty much Illinois got rid of all of its prairie. That light green area shows how quickly we eradicated the prairie, and the light blue above it shows how quickly we drained all of our marshes. Only our forests kind of made it through as things were converted to other man-made habitats that many birds couldn't handle. Next. In fact, we now know just how profound it's been. Just since 1970, we've lost over about 3 billion birds. The population declines are immense. And if you talk to birders like myself, who started in the 1970s birding, they'll tell you that even though you might be impressed now if you're new to it, what we used to see back then was a lot more impressive. And then if we talk to birders who were birding in the 1940s, what they saw then was even more impressive. We just don't see that anymore. So conservation has to be linked to all of our concerns about birds. Next. You can skip that one. Next. Next. Grassland birds particularly are just collapsing, which is why we really need to do more to try to protect them. Next. And wetland birds are in terrible shape. We've lost over 85% of our wetlands in Illinois, particularly in central Illinois. Next. And even our shrubland birds are in great decline as well. So that's why prairie and shrubland and wetlands are really important to preserve and to restore. Next. If you look at the status, keep scrolling down, I'm sorry. Keep going all the way down. So what's the current status in Illinois? Those are the four. Majority of forest birds are fairly stable, except those that live in savanna. We've lost a lot of savanna habitat. grassland and shrubland birds are definitely in trouble, as are most wetland birds. So that's why a lot of our conservation focuses on that. Next. And as climate change climatologically moves Illinois southward, we're going to have a lot of changes in bird life. And unfortunately, I think a lot of losses, more losses than gains. Next. And this will be the last slide. So conservation has to be linked to birding, I feel. Up in northeastern Illinois, which is a biodiversity hotspot, believe it or not, Chicago Wilderness Area, which encompasses the map shown here, they're doing an incredible job of protecting remnants, restoring remnants, and then interlinking these into an interconnected system. When you go downstate Illinois, you'll see that in places like McLean County, we do have some active groups like Parklands and Sugar Grove, but if you look at the county, most of that is not covered by any conservation group. And I actually know of many instances where a landowner had some prime habitat that they wanted to donate. There was no one to receive it. So we have a long ways to go to bring McLean County up to the standards of Cook, Lake, and some of the other collar counties. Next. So with that, we'll go back to the beginning slide, and I will entertain any questions that you might have.
Angelo, I already have a few questions that were gathered prior to the presentation, but if people have questions, if you would put those in the chat box, that would be great. So I'll ask you a few of the questions that had come in earlier. One person wants to know, do birders disturb the birds in their efforts to go out and find them?
If they're following the American Birding Association's birdwatching ethical guidelines, which are online, then no. And I would say, again, a lot of it's fairly sensible stuff. Certainly during the breeding season, you don't want to be poking a camera right in the face of a breeding bird, right on its nest, or things like that. During during migration, it's pretty hard to be that disturbing the birds. Again, just be respectful. You can tell if a bird is acting agitated or not. And if it is, back off. I would say breeding is the time when they're most sensitive, and that's when you want to be very careful. There's some other practices that would be more highlighted on the American Bird ABA ethics sheet if you want to see details. But by and large, I would say birding gets you in touch with nature in ways that want you to protect the birds, know the birds, and actually figure out what habitats are the birds using that you can then go out and preserve.
Okay, thank you. Another question is, do most birds migrate along waterways?
No, in fact, most of them migrate nocturnally. Most songbirds migrate nocturnally in large flocks, literally flying over your house at night. How do we know this? Well, one way we know it is that, unfortunately, a lot of these big TV towers that are 1,000 foot or more, they often will collide they collide with the guy wires surrounding the towers. And we know from studies being done over the decades that there's a huge front of migratory birds. You can now see these on radar. They have the radar facilities that just fly over these open fields at night as nocturnal migrants. So most of them actually are in these large flocks that are mixed species flocks right overhead. And if you have a keen ear, you can go out in the middle of the night and listen to them, little chip notes and call notes that they're making to keep in contact.
Okay, thank you. Question that just came in. We attract a lot of birds in our backyard in Lexington, but are concerned with the salmonella outbreak seen in some areas. Are we at risk in McLean County?
I haven't heard of much in the way of risk. Of course, the best way to avoid it is to periodically clean your feeder with a little light bleach solution, in between loading it in, because the birds often will, of course, crap on your feeder as well as come into close contact with one another. I haven't heard of it being a big problem locally. Maybe some people know different, but just some very simple cleanliness practices will keep that tapped down.
Okay. How can people make their yards more bird friendly?
Well, that's an easy one. The keys are, first, having native vegetation. Can't emphasize that enough. There are groups such as the local chapter Wild Ones that you can use to educate yourself. Planting exotic plants is worthless because it doesn't support the insects that then support the birds. So nice native vegetation. Don't be too clean. I know sometimes that's hard don't overly manicure if you can avoid it. If your covenant keeps you from doing it, I understand. But the extent to which you can get away with brushy and a mix of vegetation and things like that, there's a whole host of practices. So one is having habitat. Second is having, and that habitat will serve as cover as well. If you have a feeder in the middle of just nothingness, then a lot of birds are kind of wary about visiting because they don't feel like there's a place that they can go and take cover if a Cooper's hawk or something comes around. And then water is a great resource. If you have a waterway near you, wonderful. If not, you can install a little bird bath or whatnot, and then really get things going. And there's, again, a lot of resources. Wild Birds Unlimited here in town and Normal. They can give you plenty of tips. It's very easy. And then just pay attention to what birds are visiting, and you'll know if you're doing it right.
Is there a local Facebook birding group?
Well, the John Wesley Powell Audubon, JWP Audubon Facebook is probably the best one for most people to get on. A lot of photographs of local birds. You can post your own photographs with help and identification. You can even post queries as to where to go if you're unclear. That's probably the best one to check out for beginning birders, JWP Audubon Facebook. And we also invite you to become a member of JWP Audubon because we put a lot of monies into supporting efforts to restore habitat. And we've done a lot at Ewing Park, for example, and as well as to educate about birds and to advocate about birds. We were very successful in advocating for what we feel were very good, strong standards so that wind farms were going to be minimally problematic for birds. I thank our county government for listening to us in terms of our recommendations on how best to site these things and manage them so as to do minimum damage to birds. And to their credit, I would say the wind farm companies have, after a little bit of pressure occasionally, have actually followed the lead, and very much thankful to the McLean County Board. I think we have one of the more progressive ordinances in terms of wildlife-friendly wind farm siting. And that's good because we're in such a wind farm corridor.
What is the best time of day to bird?
It kind of depends on the bird. I would say, in general, people would say the first couple of hours after dusk or after dawn would be best, particularly for songbirds and the like. For waterfowl, gosh, any time of day was good to get out looking at waterfowl, because where are they going to go? They're going to be out on the water. But for songbirds, particularly during migration, we often say the first few hours, because they're getting up, they're having to get food after fasting over the night. Many of them will start singing and the like. But so it is good to get out those first 3 hours or so after dawn if you can. I know that can be pretty early. I'm not a good early birder in terms of being awake, but it is true that as the heat of the day hits, a lot of particularly songbird activity starts diminishing. But that's why water birding is great during winter. Is they're there all day, so you can get out there after it warms up a little bit if it does.
What migrating birds are we most likely to see during this next month?
Well, the the songbird migration that's underway now, particularly the warblers, is what most people are after. I mean, there are other groups of birds like flycatchers and sparrows and the like, but the warblers, there's 30 plus species of warblers that come through here. A few stay to breed, but most move on north to the Great North Woods area to breed. And then we'll move south in the fall in September, but in the fall, they really aren't in the bright plumages that you see in the spring. So the spring warbler, you often have a narrow window, sometimes just a couple of weeks for some of the species. So that's why we do our walks at Ewing Park, starting this weekend and going into mid-May, and try to capture the warbler migration. I would say, I know for me personally, that's what really got me going with birds way back when.
How healthy is the bluebird population in McLean County, and what can we do to protect them?
Oh, well, seems pretty healthy to me. I see bluebird boxes, bluebird trails going up everywhere. If you put up a bluebird trail, you do need to maintain it to make sure house sparrows or house wrens don't try to take it over and all. So and there are instructions online for doing that. But I would say even in the wintertime, I'll see bluebirds. Sometimes I wish they didn't stay because I'm afraid a big cold spell like we had in February might wipe them out, but actually that didn't happen this year too much. And so I would say the eastern bluebird populations seems to be doing very well.
Okay. You mentioned that we see, because of several things, one of which is global warming, or the warming of the earth. Are there some birds that used to migrate from this area that no longer do that and stay longer here?
Well, actually, prior to global warming, there's a bird that used to do that, and that were Canada geese. Canada geese used to be early signs of springs here in the Midwest, and now they're just here all the time. Why? Because we provided a superabundant food sources, not just waste grain, but lawns, everywhere lawns. And ironically, Canada geese were once an endangered species at one time. We've done probably overkill in terms of bringing them back, because I know they could be problematic. So Canada geese are no longer, if you read Aldo Leopold's book, writings, you'll know that Canada geese, like sandhill cranes, used to be early signs of spring, and now the cranes still are, but the geese are just here all the time. But that was prior to global warming. What we're seeing with global warming is we're seeing the ranges shifting or even constricting, so that we're going to lose some birds that used to breed here, such as bobolinks. We're going to add some birds that used to breed further south, such as blue grosbeaks. We're seeing other birds showing up from down south that are kind of surprising, but may become local breeders. We'll lose other birds that are going to have to shift their range northward. Again, if you think of that last one of those maps I showed you, climatologically, if we don't get control over all this greenhouse gas emission, you don't need to buy any coastal property. Illinois climatologically will be like living in East Texas today. And that will have huge negative impacts on birds, animals, plants, agriculture, people. It's not really where we want to go, but we're already starting to see birds reflecting those environmental changes, as well as plants in terms of their blooming. And one thing we really worry about is getting out of sync the plants, the insects, and then the birds, because they need to be in sync in order to feed their young and have food available during migration.
What is the best way to learn bird song?
The best way is just to listen, listen, listen. It takes a while. People learn visual images usually faster than sound, but I think the best way personally is if you download that app, the Sibley app, which includes the entire field guide plus the songs. Go out, and as you hear things, see if what you're hearing matches what you think it is, particularly if you see the bird. And the more you chase down songs and, yeah, there it is, it's a cardinal again, you'll learn it. You're not going to keep wanting to chase it down every time. And then you start keying in on less common sounds that might indicate that there's a bird. Roger Tory Peterson once said you do 90% of your birding by sound, but that takes some discipline and knowledge before you get to that point. But it is true, because you can much more easily detect birds, particularly songbirds, by sound than by sight. And again, the app is basically the Sibley 2nd edition field guide. The field guide to the birds by Sibley 2nd edition. Go online, it's like about $20, something like that. And it's, I mean, I carry my iPhone with that now more than I do the book itself. And again, I really love the song feature on the birds. Another good way, of course, is to go out with birders who already know the birds. Go to our Ewing Park walks with other birders, and they can say, oh, that's to such and such. And then just really listen, listen, listen. It takes a lot of repetition, just as learning your favorite musical piece often will take a lot of repetition. Repetition is the key.
I know you know the answer to this one. What is this thing called fishing, and is it a good thing?
Well, actually, there's several ways in which you can, if you particularly good with sparrows, but also with songbirds. This is something you don't want to do a lot of because you don't want to, and you don't want to do in the breeding season because it can be disturbing. But it's a way of kind of getting the attention of a bird. Spishing is psh, 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 psh. We often couple that with squeaking. And if you're really good, you can imitate a screech owl. I don't know if my voice, maybe lose my voice. Let me see if I can do it. I can't get the volume right now because my mouth is so dry. If you do those where you can see a flock is present, but they're not quite showing themselves, just do it a little bit, and then you can bring them up. The one thing you don't want to do, and I guess this would fit into an earlier question, is don't play the song more than maybe once or twice if you're trying to attract a bird. I mean, one of the downsides of the Sibley app on your iPhone is you can actually play it as well, which can get a bird's attention. If you play it to birds that are on territory, you can actually scare them away. So you want to be very minimal in using what we call playback for birds. Again, when it's not the breeding season, there's not much damage you can do, although you might scare it away as a migrant hanging out there. But it's like anything, you know, just be sensible about it. You know, try to get a good view, but be patient in trying to get a good view. Don't try to, you know, run up to the bird or blast its sound to the bird or something like that. Just use a modicum of common sense when it comes to birding, and they'll be okay.
And this is our last question. What can we do to help sustain the bird population in McLean County?
Well, there's a lot of projects underway. Again, I'm very pleased to see that over the years since I've been here, there's been a lot of activity going on. There's a lot of non-governmental organizations that are working very hard that deserve your support, like Parklands Foundation, JWP Audubon, Sugar Grove Foundation, the local chapter of Wild Ones with the native planting emphasis are ones that come to mind, and I'm sure I've forgotten something that I should have remembered. Encourage your local governments to not only protect areas, maybe even convert some parks to pollinator gardens and the like. I wish our local government was as aggressive as they are up in Cook County, Lake County, that Collar counties in terms of acquiring land and protecting it, but we're not, unfortunately, which is why we've lost a lot of opportunities. What they do have, though, is very valuable, and so we want to encourage them. They've been very open to very innovative management, Town of Normal with the Hidden Creek, City of Bloomington with Ewing Park, the McLean County with Conlara Park and Lake Bloomington area. I think there's been a lot of improvement there. We want to get away from what I call Midwest mowing mania. When I moved to the Midwest, I was just shocked at how much mowing goes on, just all the time. It's incessant. Mowing is one way to completely sterilize your yard. Not only does it encourage just one species of plant that's non-native, but it just kills everything. And so we want to try to get away from excessive mowing. I remember at a local park, I won't say which one, people were mowing the do not mow parts of the park, killing monarch butterflies. I think we got that corrected. So again, just thinking of logical practices, you know, I mean, wildlife needs habitat, and you need the full spectrum of the food web as well, from the plants to the insects to the vertebrates. And then, of course, in your own yard, you got a lot of control over that. There's a lot you can do with your own yard that can make it a migratory stopover site, maybe even breeding in some cases, depending on its size. And again, there are a lot of organizations and web resources and the like that can help you do that. And in fact, Given Harper, a professor at Illinois Wesleyan, has been leading an urban bird breeding census for Bloomington Normal, and we're finding a lot of encouraging increases in breeding birds, in part because more and more awareness that planting non-native trees supports nothing in the way of native insects for native birds. And as we've converted more to native trees and shrubs, we get more native insects and more birds. You can compare that to some other cities that you think of as green, like Portland, Oregon. They don't have any native birds there. Why? Because all their plants are non-native, which means they don't have any native insects. Doug Tallamy's written books about it. We've had him as speakers here. Wild Ones promotes this, and a lot of great resources. So yeah, there's so much control you have over your own yard that you can essentially integrate it with all that's going on with the publicly owned lands as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Angelo, for being our speaker. I know we've all learned a lot from you. I also want to thank Katie Gandhi from Bloomington Public Library for helping us to be able to put this on. And I want to thank Alyssa Cooper, who's with McLean County Regional Planning, who works with me on the Greenways program to help do and educate in other ways using Greenways. And again, many of the sites that Angelo talked about tonight are on the Greenways site, the one that you see listed right now, the mcplan.org/greenways. I would also like to mention that, again, that on April 29th, Mary Jo Adams, who is a master naturalist and with Wild Ones, will be talking about the native wildflowers that are beginning to appear and will be appearing even more in the next few weeks. So if you've not signed up for that, please do so. And we were so pleased that so many people turned out tonight to see this, and thank you so much, and have a good evening.